And stupid? That's what people call the wind turbines that have remained unfinished since a 2018 court order in Jünde, a village near Göttingen. Nothing better illustrates the totalitarian scope of the climate-driven national exploitation successfully imposed by powerful lobbyists here in Germany than the blunt expression fat and stupid. Leap of thought. In 2021, the newspaper Die Zeit published an article titled Under Masts, a clear reference to Julie Z's novel Among People.
2 wind turbines standing there completely still.
I've been awaiting completion for many years because people are fighting on a small scale what the country will still face on a grand scale. The forecast proved to be exactly right. 5 years later, in 2025-26, we have long since reached the grand scale encompassing all of Germany. It seems the social fabric and the polarization of our society are falling into a predatory socialist maelstrom, which has not only gripped real and fictional villages like Jude or Unterleuten, but is now spreading throughout the entire country. And in other EU countries, it's not just head-shaking over Germany's unilateral actions, but outright anger that's being provoked, because by now, not only the German taxpayer is footing the bill for our climate nationalism, but increasingly our exasperated neighbors are also paying the price. The wind industry lobby placed its orders and the political establishment delivered, which led to a new enabling policy designed to suppress critical discourse and to discriminate against those who hold differing opinions and regarding the attempt to undermine nature conservation law under the guise of so-called climate protection, says Harry Newman, chairman of the Nature Conservation Initiative, in the highly recommended book Wind Power, Industry and Nature Conservation by Wolfgang Appel. And the incredibly low level to which the political and media discourse in Germany has sunk concerning the topic of climate protection as a whole, or more specifically, wind power in forests, is exemplified by a tweet from Mr. Lauterbach, a designated forest energy and climate expert, from the 10th. This will be clearly demonstrated in November 2024. Wind power protects the beautiful forest from climate damage. This is absolutely no fake. Did he really write that? Oh my goodness. I once saw a documentary, a user replied to Lauterbach on X, about how sloths sleep for many hours on a tree, and when they finally wake up, they mistake their own arm for a branch, then try to hang onto it and subsequently fall into the void and die. That was, without a doubt, the dumbest, the most idiotic, the most tragic thing I have ever witnessed, until this particular post from Lauterbach made its appearance. Following this rather sarcastic and quite indignant introduction, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our video series Wind Power in the Forest, and specifically to the introductory video of what will be a comprehensive 7-part series. Is there no other way than Karl Lauterbach's utterly senseless narratives? Or must we resign ourselves to the betrayal of truth to sheer foolishness regarding wind power and climate protection? This and the subsequent videos in this series are intended to, based on solid data and verifiable facts, illuminate the true backgrounds and underlying interest driving the wind power boom in Germany. The endeavor is to illustrate, by adopting a holistic, knowledge-based perspective, the business and national economic, energy policy, and ecological aspects of nature, environmental, and climate protection, which are also visualized with photos, video clips, interviews, and graphics. This video series is also primarily aimed at the rapidly growing members of citizen initiatives and association groups who predominantly do not come from the agricultural and forestry sectors or the energy industry or from nature and environmental protection, and who face a tax-funded sea of fog of information, and worse, they face disinformation if they want to learn about wind power, especially in German forests. But of course also to those who, from a local to a regional level, have to engage with the arguments of citizens in daily newspapers, in public offices and in the courts, or who simply wish to do so at home out of personal interest. With over 25 years of experience as a professor of climatology, forest ecology and forestry, I aim to provide objective insights. Given the audacity in telling untruths, I admittedly find this increasingly difficult. Nevertheless, I always cite the sources for all data and facts and provide literature references so that anyone interested can delve deeper. To prevent you from falling asleep with all this information, I also occasionally throw in a hopefully substantial polemic. If you'd like to know more about me, I recommend watching my introductory video. After this introductory video, which covers general aspects and key terms such as climate neutrality, the energy transition, energy supply, and political and legal frameworks, among others, further videos will then present more detailed discussions concerning facts about wind power, particularly in forests which are too frequently kept quiet or simply presented inaccurately. Video 2. Forest destruction here in Germany, part 1, and in our so-called eco-colonies, part 2. This photo clearly illustrates the sheer extent of forest floor destruction caused by road construction for wind turbines in Reinhardswald, Hesse. Nowhere is as much disinformation disseminated as in the prettified figures concerning deforestation by wind power. However, this video is not only about forest destruction by wind power in our region, but also about overexploitation and eco-imperialism in developing countries, coupled with sickening double standards. Examples include balsa wood from tropical forests, cobalt, neodymium and other rare earth elements, as well as conflict coal and many other things. Video number 3, wind power and its environmental or soil destruction, for instance, through the erosion of carcinogenic toxins and of so-called forever chemicals. Recycling problems, among many other things. This photo, for example, shows toxic waste from a Bavarian wind turbine, illegally dumped in 2024 at a landfill site in the Czech Republic. This shouldn't happen, but it did, though often concealed and gladly kept quiet. In addition, standing wind turbines also pose significant dangers to the environment and soil due to pollutant emissions. The video names these. Video 4. Wind power and its effects on nature and species conservation, and directly on humans. Undeniable impacts on strictly protected bird species like the red kite or on bats and insects are often downplayed following certain narratives. Cars, trains and the glass panes of office high-rises are much worse. What's the truth behind it? Also, what about the discussion on health hazards from infrasound? The photo shows an example of a wind farm in close proximity to residential buildings. Meanwhile, wind farms are also being discussed in nature reserves, for example in Lower Saxony and Hamburg. It seems that greed knows no bounds, and neither for nature nor for humanity. Video 5 will discuss the impacts of wind energy on the climate. Here, not the much vaunted climate protection through wind power, but rather negative climate change caused by wind power, for example, very well scientifically documented temperature increases, shifts in wind patterns, and SF6, which means emissions of arguably the most climate damaging gas. Regarding the photo, coastal fog illustrates this vividly. Behind wind turbines, long wake vortices develop where the air becomes quite turbulent. Does this also occur in forests, in the natural landscape? What impact does this have on the microclimate, the soil and the trees? Video 6. No risk, but a lot of fun, despite all the well-documented destruction of nature and the environment, extending to drastic human rights violations and exploitation in developing nations. The insatiable greed for enormous profits must be far greater than any conscience that might still exist, even in its most rudimentary form. This video examines the business and economic aspects of wind energy. It exposes the connections between the absurdly high subsidies for wind power funded by taxpayer money and the equally absurdly high yet largely risk-free profits generated by wind farms, particularly those located in forests. It highlights the winners and losers not only in Germany but also in developing countries. Video 7. The last video. Will we continue down this dead end until Germany crashes, or are there more innovative solutions available? No analysis, at least in my opinion, should ever conclude without a comprehensive summary that provides a truly positive outlook. In this final 7th video of the series, we will be presenting concrete and actionable solutions. Immediately actionable options, but also visions for the near future with political policy recommendations. These protect the climate not just on paper, like wind power in forests, consider the working taxpayer, and at the same time consider economic aspects, our prosperity, and the needs of nature and environmental protection. If you'd like to receive notifications for our new videos as they appear, then make sure to subscribe. It's completely free of charge. The best place to do so is the Com Tempo channel on YouTube. The option for that can be found in the comment section right at the top. Background. My video channel Tempori is fundamentally independent and non-partisan. I receive no funding, remuneration, or any monetary benefits for the creation or provision of these videos from associations, companies, political parties, state or federal ministries, or any other third parties. But now, let's return from the presentation of the video series to the introductory video itself and some background information on wind power in the forest. Of course, I know that videos roughly 30 minutes long and with many data, graphics, photos, etc. are not easily digestible content. To expose ideologies but also personal motivations behind wind power in forests, unfortunately, in Germany, it again requires not only courage but also professional expertise, or to quote Brecht from 1934, the wisdom to recognize the truth even though it is concealed everywhere. In this sense, the videos are therefore quite deliberately intended to provide a lot of data, facts, and visualizations for citizens who have the courage to question unsubstantiated narratives, even publicly. The concealment of truth also applies to so-called fact-checkers, state broadcasters, many mainstream media, or even lobbyists disguised as NGOs. Often, unfortunately, incompetent, deeply reactionary, and influenced by the moral rigorism of a Quaker-like kind, ideologues, they persist in their errors and delusions, preaching about an inquisitorial debate culture devoid of any genuine insight, still proclaiming themselves as the only indispensable good, where a societal obligation for a knowledge-based critical discourse has long been established. But fewer and fewer want to be led by the nose into the woods, and they're losing trust in the state and its well-funded agents. Unfortunately, as an example of the unspeakably shallow and poor fact-finding concerning wind power, I must mention the German press agency, which already in its very headline exposes itself to utter ridicule. Quote, "The complete removal of old wind turbine foundations is considered standard practice." And then, directly underneath that, old wind turbines must be replaced or dismantled after a certain period of time. In this process, the foundation is also often entirely removed. It's just not always possible to do so. End quote. Complete, often not always possible. In the header of a single fact check, is it? Dear DPA, you're not even ashamed anymore of your own pronouncements. And dear viewers, what did the DPA now want to tell us with this serious fact check? What are the legal frameworks, the costs, the common practice of decommissioning in reality? Who actually bears the risks here if after 20 years of operation with extremely high returns, the operating company go into insolvency, which was perhaps intended right from the very beginning, who then takes care of the cleanup and restoration. Further examples regarding the truly abysmal quality of fact-finding, for instance, at public broadcasters like ARD and ZDF, you can also discover in my other videos titled Stupidity or perhaps Deliberate Disinformation. It is therefore always more difficult for them to obtain trustworthy information when even the compulsory fee-funded state broadcaster and many leading media outlets have less interest in the truth than in stories, in narratives that are supposed to make them a better, a more climate just, but in any case, a paying person. Furthermore, due to a vast number of websites and video channels from lobbyists and NGOs, it's hardly possible, even for me after 40 years of professional experience in forest and climate matters, to quickly find access to data and facts. Concealing the truth, to quote Brecht again, is sometimes very, very professionally done. It is partly also amply financed with large sums from subsidy profits, compulsory fees, or through allocations from tax funds. Critical citizen initiatives are financially operating at a very low level here. In the video about the risk-free dream returns at the expense of taxpayers, you will then find more information on this topic. For the presentation of facts, arguments, and future perspectives, and naturally my own carefully considered opinion on them, I will not rely on what we might call such dubious sources. The foundation would very largely consist of publications in scientific journals after peer review, legal texts, sources by economists or scientists, journalists who truly deserve that designation, as well as official statistics after thorough plausibility checks. Yes, because even these must now be carefully checked, as our experiences with corona or with crime statistics show. They then have the option, which is increasingly withheld from them, to trust these sources or to research more deeply themselves. Additional fundamental background information regarding the topic of climate protection and climate neutrality you will also discover beyond this video series about wind power on my channel, Temboy. For example, the specific path of climate nationalism that has been adopted here in Germany is proving to be not only extremely expensive, but also brings absolutely nothing that is truly measurable in terms of any significant global CO2 emission reduction. I had previously presented this in very great detail in 2 videos titled Germany 2045. But he burdens future generations through deindustrialization with enormous debts and is rapidly eroding the prosperity that was built up over many decades. A hearty keep it up for the comprehensive provision of its old party clientele with multi-billion subsidies, grants and aid, even for the largely senseless wind power in forests, the self-serving welfare state can already no longer afford. Additionally, for those of you who are interested in learning more about the specific meaning and the broader concept of climate neutrality, I also have comprehensive background information available on my channel, which perfectly complements the video series dedicated to wind power. When I, more than 40 years ago, began to professionally occupy myself with forest ecology, climatology and forestry science, I would not have believed that, under the pretext of climate protection, a form of destruction of forests and landscapes is being practiced in Germany and our overseas colonies, which is apparently not considered a criminal offense. However, by now, the criticism directed at wind power, particularly within forested areas, is becoming significantly louder, more varied, more detailed, increasingly scientific, and much more explicit. It is also increasingly emerging even from the infiltrated deep green ranks themselves, specifically those of nature, environmental, and climate protection. Let's just take a moment to hear and see how, as a perfectly natural and typical example, a statement from a NABU representative appears on Spiegel TV.
What particularly drives the conservationists up the wall is that their former Green allies have become opponents.
I am disappointed by politics, also by the Greens, I must honestly say. From my perspective as a conservationist, the Greens are currently not electable. Certainly one can save CO2 with a wind turbine, but the current boom we're seeing is primarily due to financial reasons. This is purely an economic activity being pursued here. A great deal of money is being made simply by generating wind power or even solar power, and that is a significant economic factor. It's about nothing else, period.
This is just one example, mind you. There are thousands of official statements, publications, books, articles in daily newspapers and websites from citizen action groups and more, all of which increasingly and quite clearly criticize the extensive expansion of wind power, particularly in forested areas, as utterly nonsensical. And what does the conglomerate of state media, politics, wind power investors in state-aligned NGOs do, which are only non-governmental organizations and nature conservation in name? It's escalating methodologically and substantively. It presents itself, despite all the data and facts from scientists worldwide, the increasingly drastic criticism from our European neighbors, and rightly so, our concerned citizens, as the true empathetic hero, illuminated by its own narcissism like a dragon slayer in a stained glass window. As self-proclaimed inherently virtuous individuals, they aspire to be nothing less than, right now and all on their own, with this very wind farm nestled deep within the beautiful German deciduous forest, the ultimate heroes saving the entire global climate. Those who confront the evil that stands in their way, that is to say, the climate change deniers, the demonstrably far-right ordinary citizens, the elderly white male nature and environmental protection advocates, they fight them with a fundamental statement presented with ever-increasing empathy. We are, after all, preserving you from the climate catastrophe, whether you desire it or not. So, do not irritate us with your questions, your arguments or your data, otherwise we will have to cancel you, discredit you, report you, ban you and eliminate you. And yes, it's truly unbelievable, I know, they let the state security... sorry, that was definitely a slip of the tongue, I assure you. The state security in, for example, Hesse is investigating, no mishearing. Among others, charges were brought against completely blameless pensioners, one of whom was a former presiding judge of the Hessian Administrative Court and another a highly respected recipient of the Federal Cross of Merit, all of them now indicted for trespassing and coercion in the forest. By the way, everyone was acquitted. The accusations made by the Dragon Slayer, as the managing director of Wind Park Reinhardswald GmbH, and Ralph Pascold could not be upheld in court. What was truly extraordinary about this procedure was the attempted intimidation, following Mao's well-known motto, punish one, educate 100, but that's precisely not what occurred. Unfortunately, in Germany, this has increasingly been seen for years as a common and supposedly democratically legitimate practice. Simply appalling. Instead, the State Security Service conducted investigations for a full 2 years. This agency typically only becomes involved in grave instances of terrorism and direct assaults upon the constitutional order of the state, but not when it concerns entirely innocent pensioners who are merely holding up a protest sign against wind power development within the forest. So, not the construction of these highway-like feeder roads now, even with asphalt paving laid right through the forest, using the very heaviest of machinery within one of the last remaining contiguous near-natural forests of Hesse. By the way, without awaiting the final judicial decisions from 6 lawsuits and 3 urgent proceedings, it was not this that alerted state security, but rather old, white, mostly male wind power opponents who, in February 2022, demonstrated absolutely peacefully and without obstructing forest workers in the Reinhardswald, as the Kassel District Court in Hofgeismar later confirmed.
No, you heard right.
I mean, honestly, could things possibly get any worse than they already are? Yes, indeed. At a Fridays for Future demonstration held in September of 2025 in Berlin, there were explicit and open calls for violence, specifically burn the old white men. Burn the old white men. And this, of all things, was in a video that the then leader of the Green Youth disseminated on Instagram. One can only call out to the citizens' initiatives demonstrating against wind power in the forest. Were you lucky that only the state security investigated you? The girls in the front row would have burned you at the stake right there in the woods. No, let's not interpret too much in the direction of incitement to murder, racism and sedition, as happened when a few drunk idiots on Sylt sang stupid songs and even the Tagesschau reported hysterically for weeks. I even made myself a note. Don't attribute to malice what can be sufficiently explained by stupidity. Pause. I've said that before. Pause. Or maybe the girls in the front row at Neukölln Comprehensive School just had their English lessons cancelled for years. This is how far we've come, wearing masks among the people here in Germany. A quote from the NZZ perfectly describes this situation. Ideology, emotion and morality are increasingly displacing critical thought and intellectual work. What is sought is the useful, the applause-inducing and often chaotic marketing of controversy. The clever counter-argument has been replaced by the enemy image, the enemy of the constitution, the enemy of democracy, the climate denier, the old white man. The label is interchangeable as long as one looks good in comparison. True, but what's frighteningly new are increasingly overt calls for violence against conservative dissenters. You can add whatever you like. The increasingly widespread hysterical creation of guilt by association, even among members of citizens' initiatives, the defamation towards left, right, up or down, has bored me for a very long time because it contributes nothing, absolutely nothing, to clarifying facts or solving problems. For those who are now gasping for air, let me state this upfront. I am not a member of any party and not fundamentally against wind energy or climate protection. I am also not against the extremely high returns that are undoubtedly achieved with wind power in Germany. Perhaps no, definitely one can achieve these noble goals much more effectively and without state intervention or incitement to violence. To do this, however, one must clearly and distinctly name and discuss the undoubtedly existing pros and cons of wind power, especially in forests. The concealment of facts and the spreading of disinformation throughout the long history of humanity have never once solved the problem, but have very often created many, many new ones. Knowledge-based pragmatism often helps, also in climate, nature and environmental protection. Where do we stand today on wind power in Germany from an energy policy perspective? By mid-2025, nearly 30,000 wind turbines on land and at sea in Germany are expected to generate electricity, or perhaps not. Yeah, perspective of ecological and economic considerations, the primary question in our video series would are we actually require any more? The answer is unequivocally no, quite the contrary. Why? For the answer, briefly recall your childhood and playing with model trains. As an adult today, would you really consider buying your child, grandchild, nephew or whoever more and more locomotives if there are no tracks available for them? Of course not. If you replace the tracks with the power grid, grid connections, storage and so on and so forth, then the example holds true. Even the Federal Court of Auditors stated this in 2024, but perhaps for many it's already considered right-wing. For a secure, affordable and environmentally sustainable electricity supply, the federal government must immediately and purposefully adjust its strategy. However, the expansion of the power grid is considerably behind schedule. The current backlog now amounts to 7 years and 6,000 kilometers. One might realize this if significant parts of wind power generation are located on or near the North Sea, but the main electricity consumers are situated in the center or south of Germany. So we don't need more wind turbines, but rather less ideology and more competence concerning energy supply. What are the consequences for us, summarized in conclusion? It's been said 100 times. When it's windy and the sun is shining, the facilities already established by the year 2025 will generate so much electricity that Germany itself won't be able to utilize it, but will have to pay, sometimes quite expensively, for its export to neighboring countries. You heard that correctly. This phenomenon is also euphemistically referred to as a negative electricity price. By the beginning of September 2025, there had already been approximately 500 hours with negative electricity prices, which is as many as in the entire year 2024. This trend is sharply increasing. But the operators of wind power plants still receive a guaranteed feed-in tariff of at least 7.35 cents per kilowatt hour. The difference is then covered by the taxpayer. Due to the frequent oversupply from overcapacity on such windy days, the feed-in tariff is more and more often higher than the market price for electricity. At the same time, during periods of low wind and solar power generation, we are forced to purchase very expensive electricity. Often this means the much maligned nuclear and coal power, for instance, from countries like France and Poland. It's important to note that from a left-green woke perspective, I have frequently observed that nuclear power from plants located to the west of the Rhine is apparently considered good, whereas that from plants to the east of the Rhine is apparently evil. Now, even the rather left-leaning Green Berliner Zeitung writes on August 31st, 2025, quote, "The energy transition is at its limit. Electricity prices in Germany are reaching record levels, but wind and sun don't send us any bill at all. And what are we doing? We are increasing our efforts and building even more wind turbines, especially now even in the forest." Question: are you really serious? If 1,000 wind turbines produce no power because there's no wind, how much power will 10,000 produce? Well, of course, even some of the most prominent federal and state politicians aren't so foolish they couldn't answer this question. So there must be a hidden agenda, something covert, something kept from public view, and from experience, these are usually the self-serving objectives of a select few. We'll delve deeper into this topic in the penultimate video of this series. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised at all that the rest of the world neither admires nor even attempts to emulate our energy policy. In my concluding analysis at the end of this introductory video, I join, among others, the Wall Street Journal, which already in 2019 and since then with increasing detail has consistently referred to Germany's energy transition strategy as, quote, "the dumbest climate protection and energy policy in the world." Germany already has some of the highest electricity prices in the entire world, is actively pursuing deindustrialization at the expense of the prosperity of its working population, yet it still consistently fails to meet its own climate targets, as it is forced to rely, for example, on dirty coal-fired power from both domestic and international sources during periods of low renewable energy generation. And that's not even taking into account nuclear power. Nevertheless, incompetent ideologues, hired scientists and jurists are still babbling about Germany's model character or climate guilt and climate grief. And we very conveniently overlook with a breathtaking display of double standards that we, for example, import millions of tons of blood coal from one of the dirtiest, most human rights abusing mines in the entire world, located in Colombia, just to prevent power outages in Germany during those periods of low wind and solar energy generation. With money. You don't believe me, do you? Take a look at my video on it. Conclusion: the so-called energy transition relying solely on wind power is deceptive. With the further expansion of wind power alongside the simultaneous shutdown of nuclear and coal energy, we face the threat of dramatic electricity shortages or conversely extremely costly power surpluses depending on the prevailing weather conditions. More and more wind power helps only very few. The current enemies of the energy transition are not citizen initiatives, protesting pensioners, right-wingers, left-wingers, nature conservation, etc. It's spring, summer, autumn and winter. We could certainly be doing things much better here in Germany. The so-called energy transition is unstable, inefficient and not affordable. According to the German Bundestag's Scientific Advisory Board, the costs for climate neutrality on the current path, which will never be achieved in Germany and is completely useless for the global climate situation, amount to up to 13.3 trillion euros by 2045, depending on the study. Money which, even with the accumulation of further record debt, significant increases in taxation and a drastic austerity drive, will simply not be available for essential investments in education and vital infrastructure unless it is directly expropriated from private citizens. The so-called energy transition through wind power is also a naive illusion. It is based on the dishonesty of a small group that, in the name of fighting the climate crisis, contributes little to nothing to climate protection, but earns a lot, a great deal of money, and uses ignorant politicians and ministerial officials, people with a stagnant mindset, as useful idiots. Further implementation of ideology-based policies denying existing knowledge will accelerate deindustrialization in Germany. Decades of accumulated prosperity, comfort and forests, both here and in other countries, will be destroyed. The previous and the current federal government have, despite all challenges, formally established concrete expansion targets in legislation for the upcoming years. By the year 2030, the total output capacity of wind power installations is projected to more than double, reaching 145 gigawatts. The vast majority of this expansion is expected to be established on land and particularly within forested areas. The brazen lie that this only happens on clearings deforested by bark, beetles or storms is well disproven by the photo from the Reinhardswald. You'll find more comprehensive details on this topic in our upcoming video. This will undoubtedly prove to be very unwelcome news for everyone, especially for those in Germany who genuinely care about species, nature, the environment and climate protection, and who, through their significantly rising tax payments and various contributions, are now contributing to one of the most substantial redistributions of wealth since the very foundation of Germany, primarily benefiting just a select few. Time, in conclusion, to refer to part 2 of the video series. Here I will attempt to refute very widespread disinformation regarding wind power in forests with concrete data and verifiable facts. Specifically on deforestation from wind farms here, but also forest and environmental destruction in so-called developing countries through a neo-ecological exploitation spree for raw material extraction for what we call our energy transition. Please consider subscribing if you wish to be informed about new videos. And now, a very sincere thank you for your kind attention, and I truly hope you'll have a lot of fun with more videos from my channel, Cum Tempore.